Thanks, Tom. Good morning. My name is Andrew Mealy. I'm with the Trammell Crow Company, responsible for industrial development in the Northeast United States. Happy to be here moderating this morning's Infill Development panel called Can America's Cities Accommodate Industrial Development? Since the dawn of the modern age of industrial development, new inventory has been largely developed on Greenfield sites far from urban centers. The availability of large, relatively inexpensive land sites able to accommodate ever-increasing building size requirements quite naturally drove industrial developers to these locations and created some of the most recognizable industrial submarkets in the United States. Super-regional markets such as the Inland Empire here in Southern California, Exit 8A in New Jersey, and Alliance Park in Dallas are testaments to this shift. However, after close to 25 years, a changing landscape may be reversing or at least slowing this trend. The holy grail of same-day delivery, to name just one example, has put a premium on the proximity to the customer like never before. So this morning we'll be exploring this trend of infill development, what's driving it, what are the challenges and opportunities unique to development in these markets, and whether the trend is here to stay. So, joining me to discuss, in no particular order, Brett Dedeaux. Brett is principal of Dedeaux Properties, a Los Angeles-based industrial real estate investment, development, and management firm with a portfolio of over 6 million square feet of primarily distribution and transportation properties, largely in Southern California. We have Bo Farkas of the Sitex Group. Bo oversees land acquisition and development opportunities throughout the Sitex target markets. Bo has over 17 years of construction, engineering, and industrial real estate investing experience. Since 2004, Bo has acquired and developed over $750 million of ground-up industrial real estate. Prior to Sitex, Bo was a vice president and investment officer at AMB and later Prologis. Kirk Johnson, executive vice president and chief investment officer for Watson Land Company, has been with Watson for 18 years. Prior to Watson, Kirk was with C.B. Richard Ellis for 12 years as an industrial broker here in Southern California. And finally, Jay Olshansky, president of NAI Global, the world's largest managed network of commercial real estate service firms. NAI is comprised of 166 affiliated commercial real estate brokerage firms with more than 375 offices. Jay's primary focus at NAI is on development and implementation of the firm's growth strategies. So, I think where I'd like to start is, we've been talking about the infill topic a lot. I think on yesterday's panels, there was a lot of discussion of infill. Two of the Shark Tank presentations were infill deals. This is clearly a topic that's perhaps more in tune with what's going on now than in future years. So I guess I want to start with what's driving this trend. Jay, I'm going to start with you down on your end. Can you tell us, from a tenant's perspective, what factors are influencing these decisions to turn towards the infill markets?
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I want to start with, I live and work out of Manhattan in New York City. So what's driving this is those 200 boxes that come to my apartment building every day, and the Fresh Direct refrigerator truck, that's the 53-foot refrigerated truck that's sitting on Columbus Avenue as a refrigerator for all of the food deliveries that get delivered in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So when you think about infill development from a user point of view, there's only a 3-day supply of food on the island of Manhattan. So in a certain regard, you have to have close-in development from a user point of view so we can actually have locations, because to go up and down our highways today, or as you probably read yesterday in the paper, if you have a tunnel that goes down and you have your truck sitting on the New Jersey Turnpike for 4 hours, it's all about labor. It's all about getting those goods and services to the final end product, to those people that are ordering it on everything from Seamless to Amazon to Google+. And when you look at it from a point of view of the user, they need to be close. They need to have that size. It doesn't really matter what the size of the box is, they'll make the box work. It doesn't really matter from the point of view of aspects of how to get it there, they just have to be close, and that's what's driving it, certainly. And I think you could say that's happening in Los Angeles, that's happening in Chicago, that's happening in a lot of other cities, it's happening in London, it's happening in a lot of different places.
Thanks, Jay. One of the great parts of our panel here is we've got two voices from the East Coast and two from the West. So I'll, oh, Jesus, sorry. I'm going to try to bounce back and forth and get some perspectives from both sides. So Kirk or Brett, do you have any, can you share anything about what's driving this on the West Coast?
Sure. I think we're experiencing the same thing the East Coast is experiencing on the West Coast. We're an inbound market. I've heard that the East Coast is a little bit more of an outbound market, but we're definitely the inbound market driven by the ports here. And then we've got a wonderful population base to serve. So the closer in is going to cut your freight cost, and it's part of your transportation cost, which is going to make up 50 or 60% of your overall operating costs. So the users want to get closer in, and kind of as Jay said, they'll make the box work. They'll sacrifice functionality for proximity to the port. And, kind of as we're booming and we're coming back out of kind of 09, 10, we're seeing a lot of rent growth and we're seeing concessions drop. And tenants don't seem to mind that at all with rent such a low proportion of the whole operating budget. So same thing, just different side of the coast.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, I would say that besides kind of the e-commerce and, same-day delivery, that we talked about earlier, you've got like a number of, I'd say, industry clusters and so forth, and let's say in central LA, or let's say Garment, for example. They need to get, these retailers want to get their product to stores as quickly as they can. So going all the way out to the Inland Empire with the congestion and the time frames, they really prefer to have their facilities closer to market. And then you've got some sensitive type product like seafood and produce that gets imported here. And again, that product really needs to stay kind of closer to the retail stores in the infill markets. They don't want to take the time with spoilage or anything else to go out to the Inland Empire.
Thanks, Brett. I think now I'd like to turn to some of the challenges. Everybody seems to want this product type. Whenever the subject comes up, it's sort of taken for granted that these sites are impossible to get ready for development. That's what makes them so valuable. So let's talk a little bit about the development process. When I think of the major hurdles that we as developers go through, setting aside market challenges and finding capital partners and all that, I think about entitlements, I think about utilities or infrastructure or off-site improvements, and I think about the cost to build on the site. So I wanted to maybe hit each one of those. So starting with entitlements, Bo, can you talk about the entitlement process on an infill site versus the conventional greenfield, and what's different, what's better, what's worse?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, in general, any entitlement it becomes difficult with people, right? So I mean, obviously you can't put people into equations. A lot of people try to put people into equations. It's not going to happen. And so by far, whether you're an infill or greenfield or wherever you are, the hardest thing is how you manage the different characters and sometimes clowns and sometimes not so much clowns, but in the various municipalities. But that's by far the most difficult, where you have people come out with pitchforks and torches at community meetings. And then, I mean, we've been at transportation is the other big one. I mean, we'll get to environmental and all that, but usually transportation is a big one that always hits the radar screen. So we've been to council meetings where a council member will stand up and they'll say, well, how do you know that this warehouse, this speculative warehouse, will create this much traffic? And they basically they relate the ITE analysis that we've done to witchcraft, because it's I mean, literally we had a person stand up and call it witchcraft, and it's the personalities that's where you start hitting the.
So do you find that more prevalent in an infill environment over the greenfield, or less, or the same? And that's really for all you guys.
Yeah, not to monopolize this, but I would say the infill is, they're a little more sophisticated on how to fleece you, I would say. And in terms of the Greenfield is not as much, but personalities will want
Yeah.
whatever they want.
Go ahead, Greg.
I'd say we found the complete inverse here in Southern California, where the infill for us in Southern California has been very easy to entitle. The property's typically already been zoned industrial. The uses around it are compatible, they're industrial. The infrastructure's in. And you're going to the city, the municipality, and saying, we've got this old ugly building, we're gonna build this nice new building, it's probably gonna be less coverage. So we've been met very positively there. We have the same experience, so in the Greenfield where you go out and, typically on an infill, there's gonna be significantly lower development impact fees. Probably the only cost that's gonna increase for us here locally is the dirt is so expensive that stormwater runoff is a big thing here, even though we don't have any rain. And so we'll bury that in a parking lot or a truck court so we don't lose kind of that functionality of the dirt. But we found it's been a breeze to entitle infill property versus, out in the, way out in the Inland Empire.
One thing from some users in the New York tri-state area are actually being entitled out of their industrial properties because the higher and better use is actually residential. So you're seeing some migration shifting from different, like Brooklyn over to New Jersey, where traditionally they've been industrial markets, but now with the wonderful views of Manhattan, they can actually become high-rise residential developments, which causes, through the zoning and entitlement process, the user now has to move. So that's something we're seeing. I think you're seeing a little bit of that in the West Coast in certain areas.
Well, that's a great point, Jay. And a question that I did want to make sure I asked. Have any of you guys had to compete with developers of other product types for this type of stuff? Any, multifamily comes to mind, maybe retail. Have you seen pricing change because of other uses?
I would say in certain areas of LA, let's take the Arts District that's gotten a lot of press lately, and that's some of the older industrial product, probably one of the first industrial areas that really got developed right outside of downtown LA. And that is being now redeveloped into more kind of trendy creative office, boutique hotels, residential, and so forth. And so we are seeing a decline in the infill Los Angeles County industrial base every year. It is declining. Of course, it's growing out in the Inland Empire. I would say that it's also raising pricing. So in some of the outlying areas adjacent to downtown LA, like Vernon and Commerce, when these guys are selling, some of these firms selling their buildings at really non-industrial pricing to creative office type developers, and they're willing to pay more of a premium to relocate to Vernon because they've had somewhat of a windfall. So some of our developments recently have been from companies that have been relocating as they've sold off their properties for a higher and better use. And I'd say, again, if you're adjacent to residential, most of the industrial that's in kind of surrounded by other industrial isn't really a candidate for an alternate use, but if you are immediately adjacent to other residential or commercial, it could be a candidate for redevelopment.
Right. I was just going to say that a lot of the times, at least on the East Coast, probably here too, a lot of these industrial areas were really, definitely in New Jersey and New York, it was the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. So what happened was these factories popped up, and then the residential came around it afterwards. So now, just like Kirk was saying about the redevelopment and infill, what happens is by right you can develop industrial, but you're surrounded by residences, right? And that's where the personalities come out. And so what we've hit is probably on a premium basis on the mixed-use development sites. Probably they'll offer 20 to 30% more for the sites than you can offer. But then of course they would have to go to rezoning and whatever. But and again, there's more other implications from taxes and other things that the town will have to get hit with.
So, so that we were talking about entitlements. How about construction costs? I want to drill down a little bit on the cost to build these sites versus Greenfield stuff. The first thing that comes to my mind often is the premium for union contractors, which I think in the markets Bo and I traverse, that's a big deal. I'm less sure of your Kirk and Brett's experience, but Beyond union labor, there's environmental cleanup, there's higher prices because buildings are smaller. Kirk, maybe we'll start with you. Can you just kind of share what some of the issues that you deal with when you're putting together a development budget?
Sure. First, when we go out to bid, we, here locally in the trade, we have both union and non-union. And we kind of look at it at, concrete being the biggest trade. If it's a critical project, we have timing, we'll probably go with a proven union guy, maybe pay the premium. We typically see less change orders. They stick to the schedule than a little bit more of the entrepreneurial guys. As you move forward and you look at the total project cost of infill, I think the frustrating thing, as you compare it to Greenfield, the infill, you're probably dealing with some historic environmental, probably taking down an old, functionally obsolete manufacturing building. So you're digging in, you're not quite sure what you're going to get. But the beauty of infill is you're staying on your parcel. And your budget busts usually don't happen on your parcel if you've done your planning right. You're going to build your building, you're going to build your costs within your 2 to 3% contingency. It's when you get off-site. And in infill, mostly all your off-sites and infrastructure are in. So you're not out in the street with city plans that don't match the actual in the street. All of a sudden, you've got to pay your engineers triple time to figure it out, and then your general contractors triple time to keep the schedule. So I think the infill is a little safer because you're staying on the parcel. That's kind of the experience we found. It's just you've got to stomach the cost because it's going to be more expensive because you're going to pay a whole lot more for the land. So you're going to want to maximize your coverage while balancing, functionality of the asset. So kind of our experience of developing there.
Okay. Bo, any thoughts on the East Coast? Same?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much similar stuff. All the infrastructure's there, more or less. I mean, now and then you might have to upgrade something, but it's rare. It's more rare than it actually happens. And then really the site costs. The site costs are the big wild card. For out in near the New York area, a lot of the sites that are left require deep foundations, right? So, in obviously not to go back in history, but obviously back in the ice ages, there was a huge glacier that kind of went through that whole area, and there's areas where you need piles that are 150 foot deep, and that's in order to build, but it's right next to the city. And there's big demand because, location, and everyone wants that last mile distribution. And, the outbound is the unreliable portion of your distribution cost. So the closer you can be to the city or really just the population center, the better off you're going to be on your costs. So, but those are some big costs that definitely, based on the various sites that are left, that's a big variable that's hitting a lot of different sites.
Okay. So Brett, the question that's come up when we've talked is in some cases, how do you decide if it's worth it? The obligation, the commitment of resources, both dollars and time, to determine whether one of these sites is going to be feasible and profitable. It's what we do. It's the riskiest type of capital there is, pursuit dollars for development. What do you look for? How do you decide when these types of things are worth it?
Well, I think what Andrew specifically, speaking about that we talked about earlier was, infill, a nature of infill, we're typically redeveloping older industrial buildings. And so it's typical in most major metro areas, these older industrial buildings, they did not follow the same type of regulatory environmental compliance that we do nowadays. So you generally have environmental issues with a lot of these sites at various different levels. A project we just completed, about a week ago, it was a former chemical plant that we redeveloped 2 new industrial buildings on. So as you can imagine, there was we had to work towards getting the letter of no further action and a lot of environmental remediation. So the challenge we have found is going into pursuit costs and so forth is when we as the buyer and approaching a seller, most of the time is not done a lot of research on the extent of really what that's what we would call uncharacterized environmental issues. So you've got to work to characterize those, and that is a process, and who's paying for that. And then when you do get it characterized, is the seller going to be willing to work with you? So you can end up spending a fair amount in pursuit costs to then discover and really kind of do the seller's homework for them, and then find out that there's millions of dollars worth of problems that maybe they don't really want to participate to the extent you feel they should, and the cost to move forward with that development and to do the remediation that's necessary. So we cautiously approach these sites. We've taken on a number of them. I think because of that, we then get submitted a number of them. We don't necessarily want all of these issues some of the time. So we really have to meet with the seller and their team and determine and come up with a structure where we feel that can be acceptable, and kind of outline the path so that I think as a developer you don't get you got to allocate additional time and resources to these troubled sites, unlike a Greenfield site. So although there's some maybe benefits to being in an infill area where you've got low vacancy and strong demand, sometimes we go, hey, we might be able to do 3 Greenfield sites in the time it takes to do this one troubled environmental site. So is it going to be worth the time and effort and brain damage and resources and so forth we need to commit to it? So sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, and a lot of that has to do with the seller and their team and their reasonableness, which we feel we need to identify up front.
Kirk, Watson has been active in both the infill markets as well as out in the IE. How do you compare the risks of being in both places and the reward?
We think the risk is significantly greater out in the Greenfield and the Inland Empire. What we like about infill development is once you make the decision to go, you're putting up a new functional asset that's surrounded by assets that are 20, 30, 40 years old. So you need to find one user that's going to either appreciate the aesthetic value, the functional value in combination, and probably get a market-leading rent. And we found those returns very favorable. What we struggle with in the Inland Empire is you'll be out, working on a 100-acre development, and you find more cow manure than you thought that was out there on your topo, and you've got to remove it. You go out into the streets, and all of a sudden the city official comes by and says, your street's not thick enough. And we say, well, here's our conditions of approval. And they go, no, we changed our mind. So now you're layering, some more asphalt down, and they reread your traffic study and, decide that they want you to not only put an interconnect in a mile away for a signal, but they want you to put that signal away because their planner misread your traffic study. So all of a sudden you're looking at, several hundreds of thousands of dollars of change orders you're trying to spread over a tight return on cost investment scenario, and it can beat you up if you don't, lease them up quick and at your pro forma rate.
Great. Hey, Jay, we were talking a little while ago about the environmental piece of this and how, virtually all these sites have some environmental history. Have users gotten educated on what the risks are of leasing a remediated site, and are they more accepting of these types of sites than maybe they were 10 years ago?
Yes and no. The more larger, more sophisticated users that want to be in these infill areas are, but at the same time you have a lot of the tenant base that's still existing in these infill locations that don't care, and they really don't want to be involved, and they're kind of shifting the risk back to the owner or the developer and really having it become their problem. And certainly once the lawyers get involved, they're going to completely try to put it in a true leasing scenario. They don't want to have anything to do with that risk unless they're part owners or they're part of a build-to-suit along with the developer. And it really depends on sophistication of the tenant.
Right, but they're not. They won't redline a site off their list, or will they?
I think they will, but what they're really going to mainly do is redline it from the point of view if they can't get the assurances from the owner or the developer.
Yeah. Okay.
So I was just going to add, in terms of why we like infill sites more, at least I think you have a lot more options, right? So you have a big population base. There's a lot of different businesses. I know everyone gets infatuated with the Fortune 500 companies, but there are a lot of companies out there that make very good money and very good living. They might not be institutional credit, but there's a lot more options in the infill. When you start going out to the sort of outside or more suburban areas, You're going to have, the typical models is the regional distribution models, super regional distribution models, and your variety is not as much. So your rental rate growth and all those options are not as there's not as much. So your rental rates typically will end up growing at 1%, 2%, whatever it is, versus in the infill where you could maybe take advantage of those options.
Great. I'm going to move to the concept of reuse of some older inventory, and at what point do we scrape buildings to build new when we've got buildings that are perhaps nearing functional obsolescence but continue to be leased because of great locations, and how we make these decisions, at what point it makes sense to scrape the site and start again. So to start with that, I think, Kirk, I'm going to ask you to give us a few minutes of and tell us a little bit about how Watson is thinking about this very issue.
Is this a queue up for the PowerPoint, or you want me to answer the question?
No, this is the queue up for the PowerPoint.
Okay, I just didn't quite pick that one up. So, been asked to talk about how we make our older buildings competitive, and we've demoed some buildings and build new ones. Just a quick infomercial on Watson Land Company so you can put it in perspective. The land I'm going to show you that we're working on, we've owned it since the late 1700s. It was the first Spanish land grant, so I worked for the family several generations away. I'm not family, or I wouldn't be up here speaking. We've got some assets that we've had for quite a while. So what the group wanted me to go through was, there we go. So they wanted me to talk about how we allocate our capital to our older buildings to help them stay relevant and competitive in today's industrial real estate environment. The industrial park that you're looking at right there, it's located about 8 miles from us right now. So it's in the city of Carson, and obviously if it's 8 miles from us, it's 8 miles from the biggest port in North America. We're very blessed to have that location, and it really drives a lot of our decisions. Some quick background on that park. All of the infrastructure and streets were designed and built over 50 years ago in the 1960s. The center is about 350 acres, and it's comprised of 57 buildings and just about 6.7 million square feet. Most of the buildings were constructed in the 70s, and as you can imagine, about 50% of the users were manufacturers, and 50% of the users were kind of, whatever warehouse space was then, dead storage, moved real slow. So lots of squares, lots of power, lots of car parking. One truck door per 10,000 square feet was considered, wonderful. The clear heights today are still about 22 to 24 foot on average, and our truck turning radiuses are probably about 115 to 125 feet. So the first thing we did when we looked at this center, it was getting tired. And so about 10 years ago, we kind of went into a whole rebranding effort. So the first thing we did is we took a look at the perimeter of the property, and we had kind of circa 1960 concrete monument signs with what I wouldn't call landscaping. So we turned the landscaping signs into base and kind of paved some truck courts. And we went ahead then and started the branding by putting new modern signs in along with a landscape theme. We carried that landscape theme throughout the park, and also found interior landscape islands that we could connect with our prominent corners, and then also tied them into the buildings. And then we just tried to make it simpler and drop a word from the park just to kind of clean it up. The next thing we did was the most important. We took on a renovation project in 2005 where we made a capital commitment every year to attack a certain amount of buildings, basically depending upon lease expiration, the customer, things of that nature. We used functionality as our guide. So if the building had a little bit of functional obsolescence, we'd work with it, and what we'd do is we'd go through and we would analyze a building kind of like this one right here that was built in 1972. 22-foot clear. So we would analyze it as is. We would put together a conceptual renovation, and then we would also look at scraping it and rebuilding it. So we would take each one of those scenarios. We'd project rent. We'd project kind of long-term occupancy, take that, whatever that vacancy deduct was, hit the NOI, put a little deduct in for CapEx. Obviously, it's a newer building, it's going to be lower. If we keep it as is, it's going to be much higher. Renovate, it's kind of in the middle. Then we apply a cap rate to it, try to get an idea where our net asset value would end up, deduct the capital that's required for each scenario, and then we just look at, okay, what net asset value is going to be the highest, and then we'd also look at cash flow. Cash flow is always going to be a little bit lower the first couple of years, but we're long-term hold guys, so we would look out 5-10 years, and we found that the renovation on paper made sense, so we kind of pushed forward. On one question we always get asked, since we're not a merchant builder and we're a hold, when we do a renovation, we recover our capital over a 20-year period. You can't do this over a 5-year lease. It just won't work if you're going to do it the way we do it. You can skinny down your scope and maybe do it, but we found that you just don't get the bang for the buck if you don't spend to a certain threshold. Before I show you the after of this one, since 2005, we've done about 500,000 to 600,000 square feet a year. Our buildings down in this park are older. They're 100 to 150,000 square feet. And we've completed about 5 million square feet of these renovations. So this is how it looks today. That building was probably 6, 7, 8 years old. So you can see the things we like to do. We like to add clear story glass. Out here in Southern California, it looks good from the street. Also adds ambient light into the warehouse. So if it's an older building, it's probably going to have less skylights on the roof. So helps maybe reduce utility cost inside and looks good. Here's another example of a building built in 1970. This architect should be fired. I mean, this, you know, I think the guy had to be blind. But probably one of our best stories, or one that's near and dear to all our hearts at Watson. We now have a global 3PL in it, Schenker. And one of the executives came over from Europe when they moved into the building, and he pulled up outside and he looked at the building and said, "Man, that's beautiful." And we had the wood and wood walls, and so we just gutted the office and built new offices. He walked in and said, "It's a pretty office. This is great." Then he walked out in the warehouse and he said, "How come the floors in this building have how come the floors in this new building have so many cracks?" So we just went, perfect. He thinks it's new. So we had to tell him the building was 45 years old, and he couldn't believe it. So
What's the clear height of this building, Kirk?
Clear height on this one is about 22 feet.
Wow.
Yeah, and you can't see it to the right there, but it was an old manufacturing building, so we turned all this car parking in. We just put dolly pads in, and all of a sudden it became a container yard. And we got about a 40% premium on the rent from what we would have got as is. So when we look at this program in its entirety, the 5 million square feet and the capital we've spent, we figure based upon increased occupancy and our increased rents, we've received about a 10 or 11% return on cost, which, you know, for us, we think that's one of the best investments we can make when we're building new for a hell of a lot less. A couple things we like to do that are just kind of standard on this. I mentioned the clear story. We'll definitely update the office or scrape it and build new. Always put as many dock doors as we can in because of the proximity of the port. We'll pop out the old skylights, add new if the roof can handle it structurally. A couple other things we've done. Mentioned we've demolished 5 functionally obsolete buildings and built new ones in their place. Each one of those buildings has, we've had no problem with cost. We've exceeded pro forma on rent, and they've all been pre-leased. Just to give you an example, we just knocked down a 245,000 square foot building, replaced it with a 221,000 square foot building, and it was leased before the roof went on, and we were probably getting, you know, low 40 cents, so whatever, $5 on the East Coast, and we got like about 70 cents a square foot on it, a 10-year deal, so $850 on a 221,000 square foot building. So those are the kind of returns you see when you kind of go through this process. you can, I won't read the other things there, but we've also cut off bays off of buildings. We found that that's worked, where you've got a square and you can cut off a bay and turn a 105-foot turning radius into 155 feet. That's been well received. And then just little things like, widening the truck aisles and the drive aisles to allow for container traffic. And then lastly, we really worked to reinvent this park, and it's been around for 50, 60 years. So the whole goal was to kind of add amenities and make it more flexible. About 5 years ago, we took on a kind of a political project, and there's an overweight corridor here in Los Angeles and Long Beach. Those are the blue lines on the screen. What those blue lines, that's the way it used to look, and what they allow is a container, an ocean container, to carry 15,000 more pounds per gross vehicle weight. So that's about 19% more per container on those designated streets in and around the ports. So for 3 years, we worked with Ports of Los Angeles, Ports of Long Beach, the cities of LA, Long Beach, and Carson, and the California State Assembly. And we were able to get that designated, that overweight corridor, moved into our park and a couple of other buildings. So it's been a fantastic result for us. And for the community, this extension's reduced the number of trucks on the road, so traffic's been diminished. It's reduced diesel emissions in the area, which has been fabulous, and then also it's enhanced job growth in the community. So it's been a big win-win for the general area. And then lastly, they're old buildings, and the worst thing your customers want are when old buildings, roofs are leaking, the spec on concrete back in 1972 was, 3 inches over native. The asphalt was a ½ inch over native. So we put a program together probably, 10 years ago, and we basically bulk buy all the materials and services for that park. We add a little reserve and maintenance fee onto their lease, but we go out, buy everything. It's obviously, we take responsibility for the roofs, the yards, the parking lots, paint, and landscaping, and we manage the entire process. So obviously a cost savings to the customer, but more importantly, the building gets professionally maintained. They get to stay in a wonderful environment. And I think the benefit our asset management team loves is there's no arguments about when the building should be painted, who tore up the yard. If the yard goes bad, we just fix it. And so we've reconciled these accounts over the years, and we just break even. It's not a cost profit center for us. It's really to maintain these old assets and kind of take it out of the customer's hands. That's
Thanks, Kirk. That's great. We really appreciate it. So, Bo, I know that you've an opportunistic buyer, have been for many years. How do you, throughout the New York Metro, when you're looking at opportunities at older buildings, what is going through your mind as to whether this is a market functional building that you're just going to buy at a higher yield and continue to lease versus engage in some sort of retrofit program like what Kirk just described?
Sure. I mean, it goes back to what Kirk said about functional obsolescence and cash flow, right? I mean, you married those two. Basically, if you don't have dock doors and you're a warehouse, that's a problem. It's if you can't really park 53-foot trailers at the doors, you're out in the street. It's a little bit of a problem. Obviously, it happens a lot in New York and New Jersey, but in general, if you still have functionality and you can gain some functionality by spending some incremental dollars, it's still going to pencil better than tearing a building down. It's just, it all depends, obviously, what your basis is. I mean, if your basis is, not from the 1700s, but, from, let's say, from a year or two ago, it's very difficult to make the numbers work to tear a building down.
I think your hold period's really important as well.
Right.
Well, you mentioned the not having dock doors. That seems obvious. What other clear heights have you looked into the roof raising and other kinds of options?
Yeah, we have. We've looked at some of that. You get to a point where if the building is borderline functional, raising the roof, It does something, but really it's more about the transportation, going in, going out, especially with infill. The closer you are to an area where you need to have faster cycle times, because that's how you make your money, mostly in obviously you don't want to carry it in inventory and storing in a warehouse, but really you want to have movement. The clear height's important, but it's more important for the newer, like the Amazons and the Fortune 500 companies. But the bread and butter standard guys that are out there are not necessarily, they don't necessarily need 40 or 36 foot clear.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, if you have multi pick and pack systems and you're investing a lot of money as a tenant, you're going to go for the clear height. But otherwise, a good slab is always good. You don't want to have flooding and leaking, right? So you need roof, floor, and obviously loading.
Thanks. Brett, any other thoughts on that as you look at these buildings?
Yeah, excuse me. Our portfolio's a mixture of Class A, B, and C product. Some of which we have redeveloped, some of the Class C buildings, some of which some of our portfolio, let's say near downtown in the produce marts and the wholesale food district. So we've taken some old brick dock buildings, old kind of intermodal transloading type facilities, but really with lower clear and a more limited functionality. And let's say we added a refrigerated panel high clear building to the rear of it and added some more dock doors and converted it from getting 25 cents a foot to getting over $1 a foot. So again, for us, a good return on cost when we look at going out and doing new projects in the marketplace. On the other side, we've got some buildings, you would almost think we would redevelop because they're Class C, but we've got a low basis, they cash flow well. We've got way better coverage than we could ever replicate in today's world. And when we run the numbers, it doesn't really make sense at this time to redevelop some of these again. I mean, some of these are some old 200,000 square foot brick buildings with 18-foot clear. But when we look at the rent we're getting and they can cash flow fairly well, where for the time being, it doesn't make sense to really, it's not really a good return for us to redevelop those. So we really just kind of take a look at it asset by asset and run the numbers and determine what the best, the kind of business plan is for that particular property.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're completely obsolete on functionality and you have potentially life safety issues where the building might fall down, like, okay, then you go
check.
and it's check and you're done.
Okay.
But otherwise, you're going to try to give it some life.
Great. Well, we are running out of time, so I want to just throw one last question for everybody. I'll start with you, Jay, and we'll go down the line. And that's really just about the future here. Do we think this is a trend that is going to continue to accelerate or stay the same or diminish? What do you see over the next 5-10 years?
Well, 5 to 10 gets a little long. I think certainly the trend continues, and certainly you're seeing more and more, let's say, 25 to 35-year-olds that are in the markets where they want just-in-time delivery. They want it today or in 3 hours. That will continue. One of the things I think when you look at the future, as those 25 to 35-year-olds start getting married and start having families, will we see a reversal where certainly right now, whether it's San Francisco, Chicago, or even smaller cities, they're trying to be in the urban, work, live, play areas. So I think for the next 5 years, it's certainly going to continue. But again, as we've talked, not all the users are e-commerce in these infill areas. A lot of these users of space in these areas are core. It's food, it's beverage, it's auto supplies, it's restocking the CVS's, the Walgreens that need to be close in. So in a certain regard, even if the Amazons go away a little bit or if it slows down, I still think the trend continues in the infill.
Great, thanks, Kirk.
I'm more in the point of origin. I agree with Jay that for the short term, 5 to 10 years, it's going to stay the same, and I think it'll accelerate. But if China becomes too expensive or environmentally troubled to manufacture, and Mexico starts making more goods, if our states, our right-to-work states in the South start picking up manufacturing in 10 years, automation takes over, robotics, and we're making our goods down there, it's going to change the global supply chain, And, New York, New Jersey has a lot of people. It won't, the demand infill will be there, but there's also a lot of goods coming into those ports. We have a lot of people here, but not a lot compared to the East Coast. So if we go from 7 million loaded TEUs every year coming into this port to 4, there's going to be plenty of buildings to, fill those. The demand's going to go down, and if they start making things in Mexico and they're kind of being railed and trucked to the population, or from the states in the south, I think you're going to see the global supply chain alter, and the infill markets won't be as popular.
Interesting.
And just to kind of jump on that with the nearshoring, I'm going to take it one step further, and I don't know if it's maybe 10 years or more, but what I foresee is so that's for spec product. You'll see the nearshoring, and you're already seeing it, whether it's Mexico or south, the southern states. So, but really the next step that at least I foresee when you talk about robotics, right, and you talk about automation and computers and all those wonderful things that you can do with technology, I think you're gonna start seeing engineer to order products where you can instead of a spec product that you're ordering something that you exactly want. You could make your own shoe that you want to have, right? You might not do a good job, but whatever, you can do it, and you'll have in these infill projects or infill buildings, you could potentially have, just like you have 3D printing, right? You could start ordering engineered to order products that you want to have, and you could have it tomorrow because with automation and computers, you could actually have it. And I mean, the future is limitless, and I know we all have a paradigm we all live in, but I think sky's the limit from that perspective for infill.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, I mean, and I think on infill you can go down to the very basic of, some of these companies we deal with, they're privately held companies or family-owned businesses and so forth, and it just comes down to the fact some of them don't want to drive out to the Inland Empire when they live in the more, proximity. They want to have some level of proximity to their facility. I don't think that's going away. Again, with some of the retailers and so forth, they need to be particularly perishable. They need to be close to where their retail facilities are, so they need to be infill. As I mentioned earlier, there's some industry clusters here in wholesale food, garment, and so forth that these companies need to be near. So I don't think infill development's going to go anywhere, but it's there aren't a lot of sites, so it's not like we're going to see a huge, large-scale infill development in the LA area because we simply don't have the property in order to accomplish that.
Great, thanks, Brett. We are just about out of time, so we'll leave it at that. Thank you. We might have time for one question if there is anything. All right. If not, thank you all, and thank you, gentlemen.
I am commercial real estate.